just be interested in a sort of little autobiography of you and your encounters with things that you never expected to happen on the internet. Sort of at the moment you realized that something new was taking shape that surprised you.
Okay, so there are lots of little anecdotes that I could introduce here. The first, more general one is that every time a web page comes back with all of its pieces, I'm actually astonished. I'm amazed. If you know all the stuff that had to happen for either the web page to show up or the email to show up or your ping to come back, it's amazing. I mean, it really is amazing. And you look at the pictures I showed with the color charts of the connectivity of the autonomous systems and everything, and you say, how in the hell could all that stuff possibly work most of the time? And so a piece of me is always astonished. Now, for people who have grown up with the net, especially young folks who were born, after, let's say, 1997 or something, the net's always been there for them, for many of them. And so it isn't very remarkable. It's no different than plugging into the wall and getting, electrons to come out or picking up the phone and getting dial tone. There's nothing amazing about that. It's just there. What is that wonderful expression? Technology is what you didn't grow up with. Yeah. It's technology if it's new to you, but if you grew up with it, it isn't technology. It's just there. So I am amazed that this stuff actually works. And that I'm not just amazed, but I'm also relieved that people have been able to make business out of it, make it self-sustaining, which is something that I was eager to see happen. I remember the moment when I became committed to trying to find a way to make the internet have a commercial engine under it to support it. It was 1988. It was an interop show. I don't honestly recall whether we may have been in Santa Clara. I thought it might have been in maybe San Jose or not San Jose, but San Francisco and Moscone, but I think it was earlier. Anyway, I remember walking in to the exhibit at the Interop show with Eric Benamou, who at that point may have been the CEO of 3Com. And as we walked in, and I saw a 2-story Cisco display. And I turned to Eric and I said, Eric, how much do these cost? And he said, well, maybe $250,000. That's back when $250,000 was a lot of money. And then maybe the people to man it for a week and so on might be another $250,000. And I remember just stopping dead in my tracks thinking, holy moly, Cisco thinks that they are going to make a lot of money out of the internet, or they wouldn't be investing this kind of thing. And so I immediately said, well, how the hell are we going to get the internet out to the general public? Because up until that moment, there was no access by the general public at all. You wouldn't have a very interesting continuing analysis that you've been doing for Pew because nobody had it except the academics. So I was committed, literally, that moment, to looking for a way to allow commercial traffic to flow on the government-sponsored backbones. And I got I got permission to connect MCI mail to the internet around the middle of 1988. And when we finally got that gateway built, it was 1989. And as soon as we announced that we had this commercial email system connected to the public internet, it wasn't public, to the government-sponsored internet, the NSFnet backbone. All of the other commercial internet, commercial email providers said, oh, we have to be connected too. We don't want these MCI guys to have this special position. And so they all connected up. And the side effect of this was that they could suddenly communicate with each other, which they had never been able to do before because they were isolated email systems. And that was an unanticipated side benefit of getting them onto the internet. But the most important benefit was to break the policy in the government that said no commercial traffic is allowed to flow over the NSFnet backbone. So that's an example of the sorts of things that moments that I remember and I'm astonished by. I can also say that in the fairly early days of Internet's deployment, when I would get email from somebody in Antarctica, for example, I would leap around saying, my God, I can't believe it. There's somebody in Antarctica that's connected to the internet. This is amazing. or from Ulaanbaatar, or from some other part of the world that I didn't know had been connected somehow. I still get excited about stuff like that. It's like being on ham radio and getting, a CQ from somebody on Mars. It's just really cool. So those are the sorts of things that for years I treasure, and I continue to experience surprises like that all the time.
How about that dark side experience where you saw something unfolding and said, "Uh-oh, this can't be good"?
Well, the first time an advertisement was distributed on the ARPANET from Digital Equipment Corporation advertising for a job, I remember the small nuclear explosion that happened. And after that, when the general public was up and spam started to be a problem, that was really bad news. And we could see why it was happening. Email was free. It wasn't free when we did the commercial email services. It was $1 per email, if you can believe it. People paid that. That didn't last very long, but they paid $1 per email when we first opened up MCI Mail. If we had found a way to keep charging a little bit for email, spam would have been much harder, I think. So we have that problem. And when the first serious denial of service attack happened, not only was there an uh-oh, this isn't good news, President Clinton convened a meeting of about 24 of us in the White House to find out what this was all about. And it was one of those really interesting meetings for several reasons. The first one is that we were in the cabinet room, and I brought a laptop. This is back when it was okay to bring electronic equipment into the White House. I mean, today, you have a problem doing that. But so I bring my laptop in, and now I can't find any power place to plug it in. I'm crawling around under the table looking for a place to plug in. So I finally find a socket somewhere on the wall and plug in. We have our meeting. The president manages to get around to every single technologist sitting at the table. And at the end of the meeting, a lot of them ran off to talk to the press. I'd done enough of that, so the president and I just chatted for a bit. And he said, that was a really amazing meeting. And I said, why do you say that, Mr. President? He says, well, we actually managed to get around to everybody in the room. And I said, well, why is that surprising? He said, well, when these are engineers, and if somebody was asked, what do you have to add? And he said, my points have already been made, go on to the next guy. He said, if this had been a room full of lawyers, they would have repeated what somebody else said just to say something, even, if it wasn't necessary. So he was surprised that engineers were, kind of focused on being efficient. But the level of scrutiny, of denial of service attacks reaching the president in the White House was pretty stunning. And of course today, if you follow any of the cyber warfare, cyber security debates that go on, you know that not only is the level of attention very high, but it's also very broad and very international in scope. It's a serious issue. This is what happens when the general public gets access to a technology and chooses to abuse it, or when nation states or other bad actors get hold of a technology and seek to extract from it some benefit. So whether that's organized crime or botnet herders or countries that want to disable some other country's use of information technology for whatever reason, political or otherwise, those are all not good things. But I think we have to accept that when something becomes this essential to the infrastructure of so many different countries, people, and activities, that we're going to experience these kinds of problems, and we have to learn how to cope with them.
And are there obvious things now that, as you look back, if you knew then what you know now, are there things that would have been pretty easy to have created in the architecture to? If you
hadn't said pretty easy to do,
sorry.
I would have
Strike
said,
that.
Yeah. Well, no. Are there things I wish I could have done differently? Yes. The obvious one is, why didn't we pick 128 bits of address space in 1977 when we made the decision? I made the decision that the internet only needed 32 bits of address space. And many of you have already heard this story, but it's a very simple one. For a year, the engineers argued during 1976 about how big the address space should be. And nobody came to any conclusions. Some people wanted variable length addresses, but the programmers hated that because that meant you had to spend cycles finding the fields in the packet, and they didn't want to waste any cycles. So that went out the door. And then the other guy said, well, how about 128 bits of address space? And I remember thinking, that's 3.4 times 10 to the 38th addresses. This is an experiment. We don't even know if it's going to work. How on earth could we possibly argue that we need 3.4 times 10? That's like 1.2 gigawatts. You remember the, and great Scott. So, in the end, I said, look, 32 bits gives us 4.3 billion unique terminations. That's got to be enough for an experiment. And, if it works, look, this is 1976, 77. If it works, then we should do a production version. Well, the problem is we didn't ever end the experiment. So you're still part of it. It's 2010. We're going to run out. So if I could have done that differently, I would have. But I couldn't have passed the red face test trying to explain to anybody why I needed 128 bits of address space. The same is true for authentication. Public key cryptography was publicly invented. It was invented before this, but it was publicly invented in 1977 by Whit Diffie and Marty Hellman at Stanford. They published their paper. The paper had the concepts in it, but no working algorithms, okay? Now, I knew these guys. I'd been on the Stanford campus. I'd just come to the Defense Department in late 1976, so I knew what Whit and Marty were doing. And looking back on it, if I only had known that there were algorithms coming that could be applied to this public key crypto trick, I would have wanted to put that into the system as early as possible in order to have very strong authentication mechanisms at several layers in the architecture. But as it happens, there wasn't anything to implement until 78, 79, and by that time we'd already frozen the design. And we were well on our way to getting implementations done and couldn't retrofit that very effectively. So yeah, I wish that we could have done some of these things differently, but I'm not even sure we could have persuaded anybody that we should do those, just given the timing.
You might have heard that in recent days, and maybe even preceding recent days, Larry Lessig, the great legal thinker about the internet and strong advocate for lots of interesting policies, gave a speech in which he talked about an I-9/11 event. Have you heard this?
I haven't heard his speech, but I've heard many people suggest that there might be an info 9/11.
The burden of his talk, he talked about a lot of things, but got to a point in his speech when he was talking about the possibility of government intervention in much more substantial ways in monitoring and assessing what was going on online. Richard Clarke, the former White House National Security advisor, both in the Clinton and Bush administrations, allegedly told Larry, and Larry said in this speech, that the government has at least a plan for potential intervention after an information 9/11 type event. Not necessarily a bombing attack. It's not a parallel to the terror attacks on physical property, but something huge orchestrated by somebody who meant us no good. And that Clark said that in a drawer in the Justice Department there is already a document almost ready to be sent up to Congress the moment after that happens, involving a lot more government activity online, monitoring online. And the quote from Clark to Larry Lessig was, "Vint Cerf is not going to like it very much."
I actually had this discussion with Richard Clarke at one point several years ago.
Tell us about it.
And it was in some, we were at a luncheon together, and this topic came up, and Larry is correct. I didn't have a positive response. Part of the problem is that the responsibility for the net is very diffuse. Each of us has a little responsibility for the nets that we run at home, and then things get bigger and bigger as they coalesce. This doesn't mean, however, that there should be no concerted thinking about what to do in the event that there is some kind of a massive failure of this communications infrastructure. So you know that when other major calamities occur, whether it's natural calamities like a hurricane or tornadoes or flooding and so on, At some point, the government can choose to declare a martial law in a certain territory and assert that they have authorities now that they wouldn't normally exercise in order to maintain order and safety. I can understand a rationale along those lines. What I don't fully understand, and I've not seen the documents that are referred to here, I don't fully understand the mechanics. What is it that one would want to impose? What actions would one want to take? What actions would one want to proscribe in the event of one of these things? Now, anyone who's running any piece of the internet today, especially any significant piece, a global backbone, for example, is conscious of massive attempts to undermine and interfere on a regular basis all the time. There's software out there running in the botnets that are doing port scans and that are doing pings and other kinds of things to try to figure out what's out there and whether any of it can be compromised. Most of the targets of compromise, for the most part, have tended to be our machines, the ones that you and I use at home, especially the ones that are on dedicated facilities that have relatively high speed. And a lot of us are not in very good shape to protect against becoming a part of a botnet. The pernicious thing about this is that the guys who do this are very interested in keeping you from being aware of the fact that your machine has been compromised. They're very eager to make use of its cycles without making it obvious to you that that's happening. So, they don't want you to send 10 million emails out of your machine and tie up your access to your internet service provider or slow your computer down. What they want you to do is or they want their software to just send a few messages out. Maybe it's a message every 10 minutes or a message every 2 seconds or some small number. But if they have 100 million of them, or if they have 10,000 of them, and there's a target, that target gets the sum of all of that activity all in one place. And so they get the effect without being apparent to most of the people whose machines have become part of the unwitting parts of the botnets. I tried to say earlier today that the challenge there is not defending against the symptom, which is infected machines. The challenge is trying to design systems that don't let the machines get infected in the first place. So we have a lot of work to do there. So I am sympathetic to the idea that there has to be some thought ahead of time to deal with serious and major disruptions in the system. But you could imagine a fairly broad range of possible actions, some of which don't necessarily sound like they would make sense. Let me give you an example. In the extreme, you could say, and again, I haven't seen this documentation, but in the extreme, one could imagine something that says, General X is allowed to tell every single company that runs any ISP in the United States how to configure their routers. And my first reaction is, that's hard to begin with. There's a lot of different configurations and models and states of software, and it's very hard to imagine General X or any of his people knowing better how to configure those things than the people who try to run them every day. So I can imagine some fairly silly things in such an action plan. But I can also imagine some very valuable things, like allowing companies that might otherwise be competitors to collaborate and cooperate together in order to build up defenses or to reconstruct the system. And so that sort of thing, I think, could be beneficial. I hope that if there is such a plan, that the openness of the Obama administration will allow scrutiny of the plan so that there can be some thoughtful commentary about it. But as I say, I haven't seen it.
One of the other kinds of attacks, though, that can happen beyond the ones you described have actually occurred at Google, towards Google, aimed at Google users.
It wasn't just Google.
Yeah.
I mean, this was an attack against a number of different companies besides Google. And the apparent objective of this concerted attempt at penetration was to identify the online instances of political activists, Chinese political activists. There may have been other purposes including attempting to get intellectual property from American companies for purposes of competition. Yes, those are attacks that we are very concerned about as well.
What role does the internet Google evangelist play in those deliberations? Were you part of this strategy team?
Me to respond to
Yeah.
the Chinese attack specifically? Well, I'm not part of the operations group, so I wasn't down there reconfiguring routers or anything like that. I'd be incompetent to do that. I'd be one of the guys that would be the subject of here's an example of how you can screw up big time. That would be me. So, no, I wasn't doing that. I certainly am part of the group at Google that discusses corporate policy, both public policy and internal policy. China has been a focus of attention for us for several years, actually. I mean, there was a long debate whether we should actually offer services in China. We constrained the set of services that we chose to offer in an attempt to minimize risk to Chinese citizens who used our services, because we didn't want to be put in a position where the government could demand information that might expose someone. So we didn't do blogging and we didn't do email there. We just had web page searching and things like that. So that was one big long debate. The other question of what to do after we had detected this fairly sophisticated sequence of attacks also took a while to get sorted out. I think the outcome was pretty interesting. And of course, some of this is still in play. But the idea that we would change our rules from the .cn filtered rules, which we had been observing, to the .hk unfiltered rules, because even the Chinese government has given some latitude to .hk. But that doesn't mean that it won't stop its citizens who are in what we'll call the .cn part of the net. If they try to go to .hk, they may still encounter some interference. But at least our position is we're sort of still in China, we're just under a different set of rules. I thought that was a rather adroit option. It doesn't, however, solve the problem that there are people in the world who aren't getting access to information as widely as we would like. So that's where things stand right now. And I'm sure that there will be continuing discussion and debate on what else to do. This is not the only, we focus heavily on China in this little bit of our discussion, but this is not the only regime in the world that's exhibiting concern about the internet content, what people can do with it in an abusive way, and what to do about it. And there are bound to be extremal explorations. Australia is in the throes of attempting to do filtering, mandatory filtering on the net, and I think it remains to be seen how this will all come out. It depends a lot on the electorate, frankly, in Australia. But what I interpret this to be is not just an extreme reaction, which it tends to be, but rather that it's the beginnings of an attempt to formulate some kind of policy that allows a state to protect its society against truly abusive practices. And it's clear because the internet's boundaries are not limited to any international edges. It goes all over the world. And that abuses that are initiated in one jurisdiction can harm someone in another, that the only way that we're likely to defend citizens against various forms of abuse is to have more collaborative intergovernmental agreements. But that means coming up with some common ground on what's acceptable behavior and what isn't. We aren't necessarily going to agree on every particular, but there must be a few things that we might be able to start with. This is the salami slice method for trying to get policy done. Let's sit down and figure out if there's something that we can all agree. Child pornography, I wish we could all agree, is just absolutely unacceptable. Someone was sitting in my office yesterday and said that there are 95 countries in the world who apparently do not have laws against that stuff. Now, this is very hard for me to believe, but and I've asked, please give me the list. But that has to be one example where you would surely want common agreement that if there's that kind of abusive content on the net, that we would agree to do something about it. And if it requires international action, that we would agree to undertake that international action. There might be other kinds of things like that on a more constructive basis. I hinted at that this morning with digital signatures and their meaning. and their role to play in electronic commerce. If we could have common agreements on weight given to a digitally signed contract, that would be helpful as well. So I think we're literally going to have to work our way through this stuff. There isn't any pixie dust that we can sprinkle that causes everything to suddenly get better. So we are going to have to, during this decade, live through the bad parts and the good parts and try to figure out where we have common ground in order to build a more reliable system for everybody.
Tell me about your job itself. Google evangelist, there's got to be a public diplomacy element of it. There's got to be a strategic thinking dimension of it. I mean, what parts of your job are the hardest?
Well, first of all, I think, does everybody know that I didn't ask for that title? I asked for.
It's a great title.
I asked for Archduke. Oh. I thought that'd be. I thought they said, "What title do you want?" And I said, "Well, Archduke sounds great." Somebody did point out that the previous Archduke was Ferdinand, and he was assassinated in 1914, and it started World War I. So maybe that's not a good title to have. So they said, why don't you be our chief internet evangelist? So honestly, the job has been something that's formed in real time. And you're right, it has public relations components. This is an example of something I do as part of that portfolio. I spend time on policy, both internal and external and international. I spend time on college campuses talking to not only professors, but the graduate students about problems that haven't been solved. You saw a few of them in this morning's lecture, trying to stimulate interest in cracking some of those really hard problems. I spend time well, as you can imagine that my inbox is fairly busy, and a significant part of the inbox has in it things like, I've just patented this thing, would you like to license it? Would you please buy my company? Can I have a job? And there are times when somebody may have an interesting new technology or application, and if it isn't, perpetual motion or some obvious, okay, we'll put that in the nut file. If it looks like it deserves some attention, my problem is to figure out which of the 20,000 people at Google ought to have a look at it. And so part of the job is trying to sort through, does this go to the business development group, or does it go to the charitable giving group, or does it go to the research group or something else? So I get a wonderful mix of things to do. The part that I like the most is regular and repeated exposure to people who are smarter than I am. If you go through life learning things, it doesn't get better than that.
Nice. You've lived a life that's full of observation of disruption that you sometimes are the cause of. So I wanted to ask, both in the sense of
you mean the screw-ups that I made?
No, disruption in the sense of the industries and sectors of the world having their lives turned upside down.
Business models suddenly get invalidated. Don't you think that's fun?
Well, there are a bunch of communication scholars in this room. There are a bunch of technologists in this room. There are a bunch of journalists in this room, and obviously other academics from other disciplines. And all of the things I've just mentioned are under siege in some respect. And Google, in some respects, is at least part of the story of their being under siege. Eric Schmidt has been sort of most aggressive, at least in my observation, in thinking about, very publicly, the impact on journalism. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could tell us where Google's thinking stands about what kind of contribution it might make, where the traditional forms of the business themselves might have to be changed and maybe nursed along in some ways by Google.
Okay. So, gosh, this is a wonderful topic. First of all, let me draw attention to an activity at Stanford University. It's called Innovation Journalism, and the man that runs it is David Nordfors. And it's a 7-year effort. David has really done some very important and good things about thinking about this problem. So I would just draw your attention, if you just do a Google search on innovation journalism, you'll turn it up, I'm sure. First of all, good quality journalism is incredibly vital, especially to any democratic society. And although it is sometimes popular to say, well, we've all turned into reporters, the bloggers are producing news, they're producing analysis, what's the problem? The answer is that although it is true that you will find some depth of understanding in some blogs, that it's a little bit like saying 10% of the blogs are incredibly precise, accurate, and everything else, and 90% are less so. The problem is it's not always clear which 90% and which 10%. So part of the problem is, as consumers of this content, is figuring out which stuff we should believe, basically, or use in the course of making our own judgments. And there are a lot of tools associated with the conventional news reporting that we use in order to make that determination. This is the critical thinking step that we should all be making about the information that we get, no matter where we get it, whether it's on the net or television or radio or magazines, newspapers, our friends and our family. We should be thinking critically about this. So what do? Well, we use brands as a clue. So branding can be a very important mechanism. I think it will be just as important in the online environment as it is in the offline environment. And I think you'll see reputation mechanisms are still very powerful as branding tools. In the blog world, there are some blogs that are followed by a lot of people. And that the mere fact that they are following the blogs imbues them with a certain amount of authority. It doesn't mean necessarily that they are accurate, but it does mean that a lot of people are persuaded to pay attention to that. I've noticed, this is something that in your earlier discussion, this question came up of how do you deal with all of the input. The idea that your friends help you is very true. I get an awful lot of attention-getting messages saying, go look at this YouTube video, or go read this article, or go look at this book. And I rely on that to a great deal because the people, and of course I'll rank order what I respond to based on what I think of the person who sent the advice. The economic problem that we have with journalism today is most apparent in the print medium. And there, especially in the newspaper medium. It's popular to say, oh, well, it's the fault of the internet. It's Google's fault for allowing bloggers to express their opinion. There are a variety of things that are asserted. Our chief economist, Hal Varian, has done some very interesting studies for the last, looking at the newspapers for the last 20 years, showing that there has been a steady erosion of the economics of newspaper for a lot of time, well before the internet was as strongly established as it has been. And there are reasons for that. It has to do with our societal attention deficit syndrome. People have tended to move away from reading newspapers to watching television news, and in some cases, especially younger generations now moving to looking at online news as an alternative. When you think about it, newsprint was at one time the cheapest and fastest way of getting a lot of information out to a lot of people. But if you, and therefore it had a really good business model. Advertising was the thing that supported it, small amounts of money for subscription, but primarily advertising, because lots of people wanted to see the news. The only way they were going to get it was once every 24 hours, or in some cases you get a morning and an afternoon edition. So that worked very well for quite a long time. Then along comes the electronic media with their economics, and here is the place where disruption occurs. When you introduce technology that changes the economics of information dramatically, and in this case it's factors of thousands cheaper to get something out as bits than it is to get them out as atoms. Moreover, you don't have to have a 24-hour deadline. You don't have a printing press. You don't have a delivery mechanism to worry about. It just goes out when the story gets through the editor, bang, it's out on the airwaves. So this changes a lot. Also, ads in print are fixed. Ads online don't have to be. Ads online can be targeted. Google's business model revolves precisely around that fact, that the ad that you see is localized to whatever it was you were doing at the moment, that to the extent that we can get any kind of a clue about what might be of interest to you, you care about that because you don't want to see advertisements you don't want or are not interested in, and the advertiser doesn't care to show them to people who don't care to look at them. So the question then is, can the advertising model work for the news industry in the same way that it did when the news industry was using print as its distribution medium? Now, here's where I'm not sure about the answer. We do know that the current crop of experiments in online news reporting the advertisements in those channels do not generate the same absolute amount of revenue as the print ones did. So that's disappointing. The question is why? And I am not confident of my conclusion at this point, but I can give you a speculation. In our world at Google, first of all, we have an extremely large bag of ads to choose from. That helps. If you're trying to pick an ad that looks like it might be of interest to somebody who's reading this news article, if you have a large selection of ads to choose from, you maybe have a higher probability of delivering an ad that somebody cares about. In the news world, it may be that they don't have nearly the same scale of ads to pick from. They may not have nearly the same amount of clue about what might be an appropriate ad. So now this leads me into very speculative territory. This is not a Google position. This is just Vint Cerf speculating. But I think that if the news industry is to survive in this online mode, it's going to have to supply something beyond reporting. I believe it's going to have to engage with the readers and allow them to take the news that they are getting. And that sounds like somebody, it might be me, with a mobile that's turned on that shouldn't be. Put it over there. Sit, stay, right? Let's see, I think that we would want to engage with the readers in such a way that the news that they're reading allows them to take some actions that the news suggests would be beneficial to them. Now, not every news story has that property, but for those news stories that suggest this news article may be important to you personally, you should think about taking an action, whether that's going on vacation or changing your automobile insurance or having a medical checkup or signing up for a new education program, whatever it is. If there is an action that might be credible, then the reporter, the reporting engine should give you some options to let you take actions now, as opposed to jotting something down and trying to do it later. So this more engaged form of news reporting might turn out to be a very interesting way of gaining readership and also increasing the likelihood that advertising could support the business. One other fact. I was in, Alejandro, you will be able to help me with this. There is a newspaper called Reforma, and I visited the senior executives while I was in Mexico City a while ago. They are making money on online news reporting in addition to their offline print. They charge people, and the way it works is they charge them some value, X, for the printed version, and if you get the printed version, you get the online version for free. If you don't want the printed version, they'll charge you 2/3 of X or something, because they recognize that there's a reduced cost of not having to deliver the paper. And they are getting people signing up for both of those things. Now, why are they paying for the online version? The answer is the quality of the news reporting is so good that people want that information and they're willing to pay for it, which suggests to me that quality of news reporting is now important. And now we get to the death spiral problem. If the engine that was supporting quality news reporting was advertising and it isn't working, classified ads have gone off online, the other fixed ads are not doing the job they did. If your revenues go down, then you can't maintain the staff you need in order to do good quality reporting. So what happens? You fire the staff, the quality of the reporting goes down, fewer people subscribe, and the thing starts to evaporate. So we are very conscious of this problem at Google, and are interested in exploring ways in which this problem can be remediated. I don't know what the right answers are, but I know that to get to them, we're going to have to try some experiments. And people are going to have to be a little braver about going online and doing things that they might not have thought to do before, just so we can find out whether some of these new ideas will work.